You know that feeling when your boss asks, "Do you have a minute?" That fear that comes up in you about what a minute is going to mean. That's the fear we get when we're not used to giving and receiving feedback. On our last episode, we talked about giving feedback. And today we're going to talk about receiving feedback, and not just receiving feedback, but learning how to ask for it and to make it a regular part of your life and your work. I Could Talk to You All Day is a podcast about what it means to be a leader while also being human. I'm Lauren Lefkowitz.
And I'm John Spears, and we coach executives and leaders just like you about shifting from surviving at work and home to thriving in the life you've always wanted.
We're so glad you're here.
Let's get the conversation started.
John Spears,
Hey, Lauren.
how's it going?
It's going, you said this a minute ago. I'm doing okay. The world's falling apart, but still here. I'm still kicking.
Yeah. My hope is to be shrouded in the finest robes on the top of a mountain and not the equivalent of playing the violin on the Titanic.
Yeah, I like that.
That's the goal, is
Yeah.
like to bring joy and hope and action for people while the world is doing its world thing.
Yeah. And man, the world is doing its world thing. It's happening.
It's happening.
It's going.
Mhm. Yeah, here we are.
Here we are.
John, I have a question for you.
I have all the answers you've ever wanted.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's exactly what I came for. My
I know.
question is, do you have all the answers? And
I
now you've
have all
answered it.
I have all the answers.
Excellent.
Ask me.
I want you to think back to one of your bosses. Could be any boss. And a
Okay.
time when they said, "Hey, John, do you have a minute?" What feelings does that elicit from you?
Sheer panic. Like as you asked that question, my chest immediately restricted and my throat closed and my palms, like even now, are super sweaty. Not just a boss. If anyone ever says like, "Hey, do you have a minute? Can I talk to you? We need to talk." Like immediate physiological reaction that's like,
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. Across the board, when anybody asks me that,
yeah.
my brain is like, what did I do? What
Yeah.
have I messed up?
Yes,
What
totally.
feedback am I going to get that is going to make me either want to cry or actually cry?
Yeah.
So today, we're going to talk about receiving feedback and some thoughts and ideas about why we avoid asking for feedback, why we panic when feedback comes to us, how it hurts us to avoid receiving
Mhm.
feedback, and how to become empowered in asking for feedback and making that a regular part of your relationship with your manager, your subordinates, your peers, so that you don't panic when you hear, "Do you have a minute?"
Yeah. I love that. I love this topic. I am a lover of feedback. I think it's so important. So I'm really excited about this because I think for a long time I didn't like feedback, and I know lots of people are in that similar position and really create kind of environments where they either can't hear it or don't like it or react to it. And so I think this is such an important conversation for everybody because feedback is super important, and it's really important how we show up, how we solicit feedback, how we show up when we get feedback, and all that good stuff.
Absolutely. And this episode is for all levels of ability and capacity to receive feedback.
Yeah.
And that goes for the people who feel like they're not self-aware enough and they don't know how to ask for feedback, all the way to the other side of the spectrum for the people who are so hypersensitive about feedback and so hyper aware and hypercritical about themselves that asking for feedback feels really scary because it's going to
Hmm.
confirm some of our fears
Yeah. Yeah.
potentially. So let's start, John, with why leaders avoid asking for feedback. And I started cluing us in, but I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the reasons you think people avoid asking for feedback?
I have lots of theories about this. In my experience and in the conversations I've had, I think fundamentally there is a sort of perfectionism kind of thread that goes through a lot of people where we want to be perfect. We want everything to show well. We don't want to have any flaws. We don't want to have any faults. We don't want to sort of acknowledge or recognize that there are areas in our lives where we need to grow. And I think that then flows into worth. We feel that way because like we think that if we're perfect, then we're actually worthy or we're like good or we belong in these jobs. And I think a lot of folks, and in my own experience, was afraid of that kind of judgment, was afraid of really being seen or called out. I mean, so many leaders face imposter syndrome and are insecure and are worried about what lots of people think about them. And so if there's any acknowledgement of like the chink in the armor, from my experience, I think it could be devastating for people because it can confirm their worst fears about themselves and about their worth and their value as a leader.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said.
I
And
told you, I told you I had all the answers today, Lauren.
you did tell me you had all the answers. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I couldn't do this without you, John.
I know. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I think that we fantasize a little bit
Mm,
about avoiding asking for feedback, that if we don't ask for the feedback,
yep.
we get to be our own worst critic
Yep.
and we get to live in our perfectionist world. We also get to ignore the things we haven't fixed
Totally.
and hope that it will go away. And we talked about this in our last episode in providing feedback, that sometimes we avoid giving feedback because we think the problem will go away on its own.
Hmm.
And I think for the perfectionist aspect, there is a concern that if we know something that is wrong or we don't, and we ask for feedback and we get that feedback, if we don't know how to fix it, if we don't know how to rise above, elevate, reach out to the right resources, we will either look stupid or we'll look incompetent or we
Yeah.
will look lazy. And
Hmm.
lazy is a perfectionist's worst nightmare, is a high achiever's worst nightmare. When we don't ask for feedback, though, we have the, I'll call it an ability or curse to overthink and spend a lot of time and energy on fixing what we think is wrong.
Yeah.
So, how does avoiding feedback actually hurt us?
I mean, I think in so many ways it hurts us. I think in general, when we avoid anything, it only makes the thing worse in the long term. So we think we're sort of able to escape something or get away with something or not confront something, but in actuality, it just compounds over time. And so this really small thing that might have happened turns into a really big issue. So if I'm a manager and I'm doing this thing that's not effective or that maybe mitigates my ability to create psychological safety on a team, let's say. And it's a small, tiny thing. Maybe I'm talking over somebody. Maybe I am reactive when someone says something. I have a facial expression. It might be a really small thing, but over time, if I'm not open to receiving feedback about how my behavior is impacting other people, it becomes a big thing. And one seemingly innocent thing that I was doing that I didn't understand the impact then can completely hurt and challenge my leader, my ability to be effective. So I think like in so many ways it impacts it. But I think that's one. I think another way is I've been thinking a lot about this in relationships is that the fact that we're mirrors to each other, that we, in a management capacity, in relationships and friendships that we have, we serve as a mirror and we have blind spots. I mean, we're humans, right? We don't see everything. Sometimes we're in the weeds and we don't have the kind of elevation that we need to see a bigger picture or see things in a different way. And feedback allows us to shine those lights or serve as a mirror to those parts where we have blind spots. And if you live your life without being able to identify those blind spots, again, I think they just get bigger and bigger and really create animosity, create resentment. And ultimately, the ultimate impact is you're not growing as a leader, as a person, and you're actually having a negative impact on your ability to lead and manage and like have an impact in general. How about you?
When we don't ask for feedback, we are only delaying the delivery of feedback.
Totally. Oh my God,
At
that's such a
some
good way to put it.
point, at some point, we are going to hit the impact of that feedback, either because somebody complains loudly enough for it to be addressed, or because it's performance review time and our own manager is reflecting on the quarter or the year or 2 years in some companies that forget all about performance reviews. And all of a sudden, you're sat down with your manager and you're hearing all of these things that you thought you'd fixed, or you thought were not problems, or you thought were actually successful, or you thought you were communicating about, or you thought were problems, but you thought you were hiding them pretty well. So the feedback will come eventually. And in a really bad company, it's going to be in a this isn't working out conversation. That feels like a surprise because nobody's given anybody feedback along the way. Nobody has
Yeah.
asked for help along the way. So, as an individual, if you're not asking for feedback, if you're avoiding getting feedback, if your manager gives you half a piece of feedback and you don't quite understand it and you just nod your head and say, okay, 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 I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it because you're panicking. You don't want to get into trouble. Then the problems become bigger, your stress levels get higher, other people around you are resentful that you haven't fixed whatever the thing is that
Totally.
needs to be fixed.
Yep.
And you spend all of this time in the dark about your performance, your relationships, your communication, until all of a sudden it's all thrown at you.
Yeah.
So you put yourself in this cycle of worry and wait.
Lauren, I think what you just said around that when we're not getting feedback, you're only delaying the impact of that, I think is so important. I had this boss when I was at USAID. He was a deputy administrator, he was an ambassador, he was a general, he's an incredible leader, and it made me think of something he would say a lot. And he said, everyone has to pay. You either pay now or you pay later, but everyone pays. And it's not the same exact thing, but the fact is that that feedback might be really uncomfortable in the moment, but if you delay that, if you don't get that feedback, the impact, you're going to pay for it eventually, right? You either pay for it with an uncomfortable conversation and then do the work, or you pay for the behavior in the long run by being ineffective, by creating harm, by not being impactful. And so I think that's so important that, and we talk about this a lot with change, that like people change when the cost of staying the same outweighs the cost of change. So when change actually becomes more easier to sort of handle in the situation. And I think that's a really good way to think about feedback is that all of us have blind spots and have stuff that we can do better, can change. And the longer we keep those blinders on, the longer we're going to have to suffer in those consequences. So I just think that's like a really fascinating, and I've never heard anyone talk about feedback in that way. But you're going to have to pay. You pay now or you pay later.
So tell me a story, John. Tell me about a time that you did not ask for feedback And therefore you paid in some way later for not having asked for feedback earlier on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a specific story in mind, but I do know that there were lots of times when someone didn't give me feedback that didn't give me an observation, right? That would have helped me in my leadership or in my career. Um, and I learned about it later, and I thought back on the many weeks, months, years where I was behaving in a certain way that had a negative impact. And I was actually like really upset about it because that feedback was really valuable and it could have altered the course of how I was showing up, maybe some projects that I was doing, working on, my leadership, my influence, my ability to connect with other people. And so it was kind of like it didn't even give me the opportunity to make the change, right? And so I kind of looking back was upset about that like, oh, I wish I had that feedback. I wish I was able to hear it, see it, take the part of it that I thought was, I could apply. And so yeah, I think that's like when I look back on the times when that's happened, I think that's for me, the kind of overriding experience that I've had of just kind of, oh, I wish I knew that. I wish I
Mhm.
knew that so that I could then change some things to be more effective and have a greater impact.
Yeah. I've done the thing where I went around the person I actually wanted feedback from to ask other people for feedback. And early in my career, I was in my HR role, I was looking for a promotion, and I had heard from others that my boss didn't like me. How anybody could not like me, I don't
I
know.
agree. I agree with that.
But he didn't like me. I wasn't, it was a young, fun company. I didn't go out drinking, I didn't hook up with people, and I guess I wasn't fun. I mean, I was also in HR. Like, that's not a fun person job, right? So fair. But he didn't like me. And what he told my peers, the other department leaders, was he wouldn't promote me unless he was forced to. I was too afraid to ask him about that. So I went around him to like the regional head of HR, who was his friend, who clearly did not know how to give me the feedback. And I was a high performer. I had any other new HR person in the area, and there were probably 20 or so, came to me to be trained, and then I mentored them. And some of them were a level above me. And it didn't make sense that I wasn't being promoted.
Yeah.
And I asked this woman in HR for feedback, and her response was, Lauren, is there nothing that you can think of to improve upon? Now, she didn't have any information. She knew I was a good performer. She didn't have any information from my direct boss, and she was friends with him. And what I realized later was that she didn't know what feedback to give me.
Yeah.
So she threw it back to me. Well, I'm super critical of myself. So, of course, I could think of a million things I was doing wrong that nobody else probably thought I was doing wrong. And I still, to this day, regret that at that point I didn't have the confidence to go to him myself and say, I've heard from this person and this person and this person that you've said that you won't promote me. And I'd like
Hmm.
to know why. Eventually, I had a very successful HR career and I had different bosses and I learned to stand for myself, got my own coach. And I would approach it differently now, but I really regretted that I didn't ask for it because what it actually ended up doing, and I don't think this was her intention, was that it knocked me down a notch in my confidence and made
Yeah.
me think that she secretly knew all of these things I wasn't doing well.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So ask for that feedback, right? Is the short answer. Just do it.
It's easy.
Just
Oh my
ask.
God. Just
Easy
go.
peasy. Let's talk to our listeners about the how.
Yeah.
If I am in a business relationship with my boss, my peers, the people who report to me, how do I go about asking for feedback when I feel weird about asking for feedback and when maybe the culture of the company doesn't quite support frequent, regular feedback?
Yeah, I think the way that I've done this with teams that I've worked with, and even in like my personal relationships, is, and this sounds probably like super cheesy and esoteric, but like creating space for that. I think there has to be some spaciousness in the relationship for there to be feedback. And so what I often do, particularly, if I'm a manager and when I was managing a bunch of people, it would be something that I would ask for in meetings and our one-on-ones. Hey, how can I help support you more? Instead of just being like, hey, what feedback do you have for me? I would ask some kind of feedback around certain areas that I was interested in to help teach people how to give feedback. Because oftentimes, giving feedback can be really challenging. It can be hard to give it, and hard to receive it. And so, what I try to do is create space around making people feel safe to give feedback and asking people specific questions around things. So, hey, I led this all hands last week. What do you think went well? What could I do better next time? I think asking people very specific questions really helps them give you that feedback, which then gives them confidence and creates trust between the person who's giving the feedback and receiving it. And I think a lot of people are afraid to give feedback, one, because they don't know how to do it, but also because they're afraid of the response. So I would say maybe the second or third thing to do in asking for feedback is to make sure that your response is not defensive, that it's warm, that it's welcoming, that it's grateful for it. Because if you create a lot of space and you ask a lot of questions, but you don't create the sort of trust and safety for people to give you feedback, they're just not going to do it. Lauren, if I give you feedback or you give me feedback and I'm super defensive and I disagree with you and we get in an argument, there is no way I'm going to give you feedback the next time you ask for it because you're not really kind of, your actions aren't matching what you're saying. And so I would say my formula for feedback is like create the space, ask for specific questions, and to make sure that my responses are grateful and thoughtful in my response to what people are saying when they're giving me feedback. How
Yeah,
have you thought about this?
I think one thing that you said really struck me, which is the idea of not being defensive. And that can be hard because we want to stand for ourselves, we want to defend ourselves. We also want to have all the answers.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you all permission today to replace being defensive with phrases like, I'd like to take some time to think about that.
Hmm.
Before I respond, I want to look into some things. Is that okay? You're giving yourself the pause so you don't have to have an answer. And so you don't have to jump in to defending yourself right away. So I think
Yeah,
that was a really good point about not getting defensive, about coming in with warmth and openness and all of that. And we're humans. We're sometimes I'm offended by feedback that I've gotten.
totally.
Um, and other times I'm offended and it's also correct,
Right. Totally.
which I hate. So I
Right.
need some time to absorb it, to get through my feelings. It's not the feedback giver's responsibility to coddle me. It's my responsibility to either come back and say, in a non defensive way, in a constructive way, I don't agree with this feedback and I'd like to tell you why. And then I'd like to see where we go from here. Or to say, I heard it, I hated it, and I'm going to do something about it. So
Yeah.
thank you for that feedback.
I'd also say I think a lot of times when I've been given feedback, particularly in areas where like it was an outlier or it was like a one-off situation, I do have this sort of very natural desire to defend and say, well, let me just tell you why I did this. And I would just argue, like, you don't need to do that, right? Like, I think there might be times where there's a conversation about maybe they're asking why you did something and that's important. But I think when someone gives you feedback, I think, thank you so much for being honest and candid with me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to take that into account and think about how I can integrate that into kind of what happens next. I think like that's a really great answer because oftentimes sometimes we just see things differently. One of the things that I like to do also when I'm receiving feedback is this is my philosophy is like take the good, reject the bad. Some people want to give you feedback on like perfect personal preference, like a way that they would do it. And that's like for me that like counts a little less than, hey, this is the impact you're having on, here's some feedback on your behavior, and this is the impact that it's having on. So when someone like gives me feedback on my approach and it's different from theirs, hey, thanks, I appreciate it. Really meaningful feedback is like when people are identifying behavior that you're doing and the impact, both positive and sort of maybe negative. I think that's like thinking about the real meat of feedback that way is has been super helpful for me because then I can get all spun up of like, oh my God, everyone's telling me to do 50 different things. I can't do that, right? I'm just like myself. And I think distinguishing like personal preferences from things that are actually causing an impact are super important from the receiver of the feedback.
Yeah, totally agree. I think a piece that I want to bring back from the beginning of our conversation is, do you have a minute?
Yeah.
I don't know
Ugh,
anybody
I
who is
still feel it.
comfortable with that.
Yeah.
When my boss comes in and says, do you have a minute? I'm wondering what I did wrong. When my peer comes in and says, do you have a minute? I'm wondering what I did wrong. When my direct report comes in and says, do you have a minute? I think they're going to hand me their notice.
Hmm.
The do you have a minute is never good. The only time that you should give that on the spot feedback without any warning, without any prompt is in an emergency.
Yeah.
Like literally, why did you light a match and start a fire in the office? And there's no do you have a minute before that.
Right.
There's like, what happened that caused you to make that decision?
Yeah.
Very rarely, unless we are actual brain surgeons or rocket scientists, do we need such immediate feedback. So plan your feedback. And if you are asking for feedback, tell the person you're asking that you're going to ask them for feedback, then ask them for feedback,
Yeah.
then listen. And then if you need to respond, you get to respond. And if you go on that path, nobody is surprised. You may be uncomfortable. It's a practice to learn
Yeah.
how to give feedback, to learn how to receive feedback. But tell people you're going to ask them for feedback because otherwise it can feel like I'm jumping into your face and saying, hey, John, how did I do?
Mhm.
And John, you're caught off guard and you don't know, you haven't even analyzed it yet. And now you're trying to figure out how to give me what I think I need.
Yep.
And nobody does well with that. I think if you have scheduled times to receive feedback, exchange feedback, give feedback, that you're creating a pattern of expectation that we're having open dialogue, that we're having honest conversations, and that when you tell somebody, I'm going to ask you for feedback or I'm going to give you feedback, there isn't this expectation that it's always going to be, well, something bad happened and now we have to talk about it.
Hmm.
Because feedback also can be and should be really positive. I want to know not only when something has gone wrong, but also what's working. Because
Totally.
if I experimented with something and I didn't get any feedback on it, I'm not going to necessarily think to do it again.
Yeah. I think that's so important. I think we oftentimes think feedback is bad. It's like, hey, here's the stuff that you can improve. But feedback positive feedback is, I think, just as important as constructive feedback. You need to balance both of those things because as humans and as leaders and managers, we're taking in data all the time of like what's working, what's not working, where do we need to adjust? And we've talked a lot about this on the podcast. We oftentimes have a negativity bias where we just focus on the negative things. And so we need that positive reinforcement. We need people to come to say, hey, this is working really, really well. That's not to say we need to sort of seek approval externally, although it's nice for people to recognize that. Really, that approval should come within, but it's important to take in all the data, to hear people say, hey, this one thing that you're doing is really, really working. Continue to do it. Like that's such an important thing for a leader to hear as they're taking in all the data from their own personal experience, the results that they're seeing, feedback they're getting. All of that, I think, is so important for anyone to be getting both that sort of constructive feedback and positive feedback on a regular basis.
Absolutely. John, as we're getting ready to close, you talked about asking questions so that you get solid feedback. What kinds of questions would you ask if you're trying to elicit feedback out of somebody?
One, I would ask open-ended questions instead of like, did this go well? Yes or no, those sorts of yes or no questions or one-word questions. So I'd phrase questions that allow people to respond openly and freely without leading them, to a specific direction. And the kinds of questions that the answers that I'm really interested in are around sort of what was the impact? What was the experience that people had? Did this align with expectations? Those sorts of things I think are sort of important because I'm really interested in how is my behavior impacting the business, the bottom line, my relationships, the culture, those sorts of things. So I would ask questions sort of like in that area for the most part. Yeah.
Yeah. I really like the simplicity of Stephen Covey's pattern of feedback, which is continue, stop, and start feedback.
Yeah. I
It's
love
so
that.
simple. And if you don't have those open-ended questions yet, if you're still working on creating your path to asking for feedback, you can ask about a specific task, project, your job, your relationships, your communication style, and you can ask, what should I stop? What should I continue? And what should I start?
I love that. That is such a powerful and a simple tool. And it's a great way like to be thinking about sort of a project that happens or a way of doing business or anything you can apply that to. And it's just a really simple, straightforward, easy to use tool for people. I love it.
Thank you, John. I could talk to you all day
All
about
day,
this and
every day.
everything else. But we're at the end of our episode. So thank you, listeners, for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
We're so grateful you decided to be with us during this episode. Subscribe, rate, and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. And join us next time for more Real Talk.